What do shoes, sermons, and boarding houses have in common? You're about to find out on this episode of Forgotten Felonies.
Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica.
And I'm Olivia.
And this is where we take you back in time to rediscover the tales of vintage villainy that time forgot.
And today's case is yet another one that came to our attention while investigating the case of Alfred Knapp. Over in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, this case was considered the biggest crime of the 19th century. There was even a folk song written about this crime.
That's true. The lyrics vary from version to version, which I think is pretty typical of folk songs, but they all aim to keep the story of Pearl Bryan alive. With that being said, let's get to it. Let's take a walk back in time to 1896.
Now people, if you listen, a story I'll relay that happened near Fort Thomas in old Kentucky State.
It was Sunday, February 2nd, 1896. Two young students from the Ohio College of Dental Surgery made their way to downtown Cincinnati to the lavish Sinton Hotel. That afternoon, there was an event to be held in the ballroom. It wasn't a dance, nor was it a dental convention. This was a sermon to be given by the most famous evangelist in America, Dwight L. Moody. Mr. Moody was considered the most renowned divine pulpit speaker of his generation. Before Mr. Moody had even announced which part of the Testament his sermon would address that day, he made an announcement to the large crowd before him. He began with a short anecdote.
A young man often remains a year more in a county jail awaiting his trial. In Texas, I saw one man who had killed his sweetheart in an attempt to cover the crime of adultery. He had no bed to sleep on, no chair to sit upon. He spread his blanket on the floor at night and lay down. In the penitentiaries, men are given employment, but in the county jails, they are idle, and the time drags wearily on. I said to this man, "Would you read a testament if I sent you one?" He said, "Oh yes, anything to make the time pass rapidly."
Mr. Moody then pulled a little volume from his pocket and said that he had already sent correspondence to every single sheriff in every single county in the United States. And he said that his plan was to put one of those little 10-cent volumes in every cell of every county jail in America.
Whoa.
The ushers will pass the hat and let everybody contribute.
It sure would be interesting to know whether or not those two dental students dropped a dime into the hat, especially to buy testaments for young men who may have killed their sweethearts to hide a secret.
Yes, very interesting.
Indeed. Because only a few days later, newspapers would discover who those two young men had been. I can only imagine the vulnerable feeling of exposure that may have arisen in the pit of their stomachs, and it only would have gotten worse when Mr. Moody announced the text he would be addressing in his sermon. It was from Galatians. The message of this sermon was,
"Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall also reap."
Looking back after the arrests, newspaper writers couldn't help but see the sermon as eerily appropriate. The newspaper later asked a chilling question. What must those two men have been thinking as they listened? We'll never know, but we do know this. 4 days earlier, a young woman had quietly boarded a train in Greencastle, Indiana, never imagining that within a week, her murder would become one of the most infamous crimes in American history.
In 1896, Cincinnati sat on the north bank of the Ohio River. Across the water were Covington and Newport, Kentucky. Just beyond them stood the military post at Fort Thomas. Thousands of people crossed those bridges every day, soldiers going out for a night on the town, businessmen, shoppers, travelers, and young couples looking for an evening away from the city.
Fort Thomas wasn't just another neighborhood. It was one of the Army's major military posts at the time. I was once an Army wife myself, and I remember how bars, barber shops, and strip clubs lined the main roads approaching and leaving the posts. It wasn't too different back then. In 1896, outside Fort Thomas, there were a number of saloons, pool halls, and houses of ill fame.
Pray tell, what is a house of ill fame?
Well, back in the 1890s, newspapers rarely ever used the word brothel. There were a lot of different euphemisms. House of ill fame was the most common, but also bawdy house, and that's spelled B-A-W-D-Y, or sporting house, or low resorts, or even den of vice. The women were referred to as women of the town, or sporting women, or frail sisters, or women of doubtful reputation, or even just unfortunates. And these are just a few from much longer lists.
So like den of iniquity, right?
Den of iniquity.
Or a tenderloin girl.
Yes. yes, exactly.
Okay, so a house of ill fame was just a polite Victorian newspaper term for a brothel.
Yes, and there were a number of these houses not far from the army post or from the dental college, and there was no shortage of business for the women of the town. Soldiers, evidently, haven't changed much over the years.
Who would have known?
No offense, kinda. Now, let's turn our attention over to Greencastle, Indiana, which was 158 miles to the west of Cincinnati.
Greencastle, Indiana was a bustling college town in 1896. DePaul University had just been renamed from Indiana Asbury University. Many of the Greencastle residents had some kind of connection to the university, but certainly not all. The Bryan family lived 2 miles outside of Greencastle. Alex Stanford Bryan was a farmer. He was married to Susan Jane Farrow Bryan, and together they had 12 children. Their oldest child was born in 1850, and their youngest was born 25 years later in 1875. The youngest of their daughters was Pearl Bryan, born in 1872. She had a little brother, Frank, who was the youngest of the bunch. Because she was the youngest girl, she was seen as very precious and lovable by her parents and all of her older siblings. In January of 1896, Pearl Bryan was 23 years old and still living at home. 2 of her sisters, Mary and Ella, owned a millinery business, and Pearl would help at the shop from time to time.
As a reminder, we learned what a millinery business was back when we covered the Hill family axe murders. Mrs. Hill also owned a millinery business at some point, and that is a hat shop. So Pearl's older sisters owned their own hat shop. Women back then didn't leave home without hats in 1896, and their hat collections would typically become quite extensive as the years went on. And these hats were fancy. We're talking feathers and ribbons and all kinds of stuff. It was a whole thing.
It's like us with shoes now.
Yeah.
Anyways, Pearl Bryan had graduated from Greencastle High School with the class of 1892. Friends and classmates remembered her as quiet and reserved, not the sort of young woman who wanted a lot of attention. After graduation, she spent most of her time at home with her family. Even though the papers say she only had a few close friends, it is noted that she would go to parties and other socials in the area. She was very reserved, though, and there is no mention of her having any romantic links to anyone.
One of Pearl's best friends was Miss Estella Jane Fisher, daughter of Mrs. Louisa W. Fisher. The Fishers were from Greencastle, Indiana as well, but they had relocated to Indianapolis at some point prior to 1896. The two cities were about 49 miles apart, and Pearl would sometimes take the train over to Indianapolis to spend time with Estella. There was one young man who spent a great deal of time at the Bryan home. The family called him Willie.
William Farrow Wood was the child of one of Pearl's first cousins, making him her first cousin once removed. In January of 1896, William was 19 years old. William's father was Reverend DeLoss M. Wood. He was the presiding elder of the Green Circuit of the Methodist Episcopal Church. That is a tongue twister. I don't like that. Today, we'd probably call that position a district superintendent. Or, if you were part of the LDS church, it would be similar to a stake president. Rather than serving just one congregation, a presiding elder supervised many churches and pastors across a larger region. It was one of the highest leadership positions in the Methodist Church, making Reverend DeLoss M. Wood a well-known and highly respected figure throughout West Central Indiana.
Now, young Will, at 19, liked to party. Maybe it was because he was raised in a strict religious home, I don't know, but he had a tendency to hang out with a rough crowd. He liked to drink alcohol, and he really liked girls. He was considered to be one of the most respectable young men in Greencastle, but what he portrayed to the larger public was all a facade, really. And part of that was due to the company he kept. Because not far from the Wood home was the home of Mrs. Sarah Jackson. She was the widow of a retired sea captain.
Sarah Jackson had initially married Captain Frederick Thomas Thurell on August 1st, 1854. They had a daughter the following December and named her Mary F. Thurell, known as Minnie. Captain Thurell died just 13 months after the marriage in September of 1855. Sarah then married Samuel Jackson on April 7, 1861. Together, they had a son they named Scott E. Jackson. Scott was born March 1, 1869 in Maine. Samuel Jackson then died in 1884, leaving Sarah a widow for a second time.
After her first husband, the sea captain, died, she seemed to have considerable financial means. Now, Sarah wasn't simply a wealthy widow. Before relocating to Greencastle, Indiana, she had served as president of New York's Cirrhosis Club, which was one of the country's earliest women's organizations. She was quite well known in the best social circles. Mrs. Jackson and her son had lived in Jersey City, New Jersey, before Sarah moved to Greencastle, Indiana. She actually moved there specifically because she wanted Scott to receive an excellent education. She absolutely adored her son, even though he wasn't the most obedient of her two children. In Jersey City, New Jersey, Scott had already been involved in a major scandal. He and a friend named Alexander Letts embezzled $23,000 from Alexander's place of employment, which was the Pennsylvania Railroad Company.
And that would be equivalent of $883,925.34 in 2026.
And that is a huge amount of money to steal. Well, Scott and Alexander then used that stolen money to open up a saloon and to gamble on horse races. When they were caught, Scott had no problem throwing his friend under the bus. He turned state's evidence and sent his friend to prison, and Scott walked free.
Would you say he walked scot-free?
I see what you did there. Yes, he just walked away scot-free. Now, he had a bad reputation in Jersey City, so he left. His mother had already moved to Greencastle, and it was after the legal kerfuffle that Scott moved over there with her. And now Scott Jackson and Will Wood lived just down the street from each other. It wasn't long before they crossed paths, and they became good friends almost immediately, despite Scott being 6 years older than Will. Scott Jackson himself was quite the player. He took many different girls out for buggy rides. The girls thought he was so dreamy with his blonde hair and mustache, his red beard, and his steel blue eyes. He was about 5'7" and 135 pounds, so on the smallish side. That didn't matter. The girls fell at his feet. He really seemed to enjoy playing the field without developing any actual feelings for any of these ladies. Young Will Wood seemed to want to be just like him. The topic of many of their conversations were about girls. The newspapers later referred to some of Will's letters written to Scott Jackson as indecent and not suitable for print.
I mean, it certainly would not be appropriate for the son of the presiding elder of the Methodist Episcopal Church.
Episcopal? You're right. It would not be. Not at all.
I just want to say, I will never be able to say that word.
Episcopal? That's so funny. I think when my mom was young, she was raised Episcopalian, so I've always known how to say that.
Nope, not me.
How funny. Okay. So when Scott Jackson moved in with his mother, he enrolled in DePauw University. His older half-sister, Minnie, was actually married to a Latin professor, Dr. Post. And so the Posts lived right next door to Scott Jackson and his mother. So very, very close quarters there.
And they had 2 children, too. He was an uncle.
That would be cool for Sarah to have, her daughter next door with her 2 grandkids. Like, that was a sweet little setup there. Well, according to newspapers, Scott's health began to fail in early 1894, which prompted him to leave DePauw University, and he decided to study dentistry instead. I wonder what he was initially studying, like why he would have to drop out if he could still go to dental school. You know what I mean?
Maybe he didn't like cutting people open.
They still had to do dissections in dental school. Okay, so Scott and his mother moved to Indianapolis. They left Greencastle. They moved to Indianapolis in October of 1894, and they were boarding with a man named Jacob Lotshar. Scott enrolled in the Indiana Dental College for the 1894 to 1895 regular session, which ran from early October to the end of March.
Thanks to Jacob Lotshar, Scott found a Saturday job at a place called the Wen Clothing Store. And yes, that was really its name. Back in 1875, before the store opened, the owner started running mysterious advertisements that simply asked, "When?" in all caps. At the same time, the storefront displayed a sign that said, "We'll be here soon." People all over Indianapolis started asking, when is this place ever going to open? The mysterious ads really had people talking. The publicity worked so well that the owner just embraced the joke and officially named it The Wen. By the time Scott Jackson worked there, it had become one of the biggest and best-known clothing stores in all of Indianapolis.
Yep. So I thought that was pretty funny. At first I was like, am I reading this correctly? Like, is it really when? But yeah, it was. So Scott didn't seem to be incredibly grateful for this job because he would arrive at work intoxicated most of the time. And pretty much every week when he was working, there were girls literally waiting around like for him to get off work. So they're just
at the Wen.
Yeah, loitering at the Wen until his shift was over. During the time that Scott was away from Greencastle, William Wood would send him letters. And Will even took the train to Indianapolis for some wild weekends with Scott every now and then. At the Indiana Dental College, Scott Jackson met another student by the name of Alonzo Walling. Interestingly, Alonzo Walling was also much younger than Scott.
So we couldn't find an exact birth date, but Alonzo M. Walling was born in 1875 in Mount Carmel, Franklin County, Indiana. His parents were Samuel A. Walling and Sarah Roberts Walling. Alonzo's father died in December of 1881 when Alonzo was 5 or 6 years old, leaving his mother destitute and raising 3 sons. But about that, Alonzo may have been pretty little, but his older brother Clinton was 19 years old when their father died, and his brother Charles was 17. That means Clinton was already an adult, and Charles was on the cusp of adulthood. So really, their mother just had one young child to raise. When Alonzo was 13, his mother moved with him to Greenfield, Indiana. She ran a boarding house to make ends meet, and Alonzo got a job in a glass factory to help bring in an income for his mother. He worked there for 4 years, right up until the glass factory closed. After that, his mom, by self-sacrifice, sent him to the Indianapolis Dental College. Alonzo, even though he was a very young student, became one of the top students there. The newspapers say that he went home to Greenfield, Indiana, from his dental school in Indianapolis every evening. That would have been about an hour-long commute by train, and on Saturdays, he worked as a dental assistant for Dr. Sparks in Greenfield.
Alonzo and Scott became very close friends and began spending a lot of their time together. There was even one time when Scott was so drunk that he was just not functional. So Alonzo showed up at Lotshar's boarding house, and he made probably the most lame excuse ever. He told Jacob Lotshar that Scott would not be coming home that night because he was attending a tea party. Lotshar didn't buy that for a second, so he started drilling Alonzo, like, where is he really? What's going on? Until Alonzo admitted that Scott was just extremely drunk, and he didn't want Scott's mother, Sarah Jackson, to see Scott in that condition. Alonzo said that he was going to take Scott to his own room and just take care of him until he sobered up.
A tea party.
Yep.
Interesting. So Alonzo sounds like a really good friend.
I agree. It sounds like he was looking out for Scott. So when the regular session at the dental college ended in March of 1895, Scott and his mother moved back to Greencastle, Indiana. William Wood, being related to Pearl Bryan and obviously her whole family, would go over to their house quite often. After Scott Jackson returned to Greencastle from Indianapolis in March of 1895, Will began taking him with him over to the Bryan home from time to time. And this is how Scott and Pearl met. Pearl had beautiful golden blonde hair. She had blue eyes. She was considered to be quite attractive. She was always neatly dressed and just entirely respectable. When they met in March of 1895, Pearl would have been 22 years old, and Scott would have just celebrated his 26th birthday. They would hang out from time to time, but Pearl never really spoke about Scott to her friends or family. Like, he wasn't on her mind. She wasn't infatuated with him or anything like that. And he certainly was not considered to be a suitor of hers. He was just a friendly guy, fun to hang out with, who they had met through a trusted cousin. In fact, her whole family, parents included, thought Scott Jackson was a really great guy. They trusted him completely, and they found him to be perfectly respectable. And as I said before, Scott hung out with lots of young women. His sister later said that he never liked any one girl more than any other. So, like I said before, it sounds like he was just playing the field. But the meeting of these two young people would change the course of history forever. Their lives intertwined and took a turn down a dark path that they could never come back from.
We interrupt this program to bring you breaking news. Scientists around the world are buzzing over a remarkable discovery from Germany. Professor Wilhelm Röntgen claims to have discovered a mysterious new kind of light, capable of passing through flesh while leaving bones clearly visible. Photographs made with these so-called X-rays appear to show the skeleton inside a living person's hands, all without making a single incision. Universities and hospitals across Europe and America are already racing to repeat the astonishing experiments. Could this strange new discovery revolutionize medicine? Perhaps the days of hiding skeletons are coming to an end. Only time will tell. And now, back to your regularly scheduled programming.
It was approximately January 24th, 1896, when Pearl Bryan went to the office of a young attorney named Wren Carpenter in Greencastle. Pearl knew Wren pretty well and even went along with him sometimes when he had to make some visits to other towns. That day, he wasn't in his office, so she left a message saying that she wanted to meet him on important business. When he saw the message, he headed over to the millinery store owned by Pearl's sisters, knowing that she often helped them out. And sure enough, she was there. She pulled up a chair for Mr. Carpenter and told him that she was hoping to borrow money. She said that she wanted to buy a stock of gloves to put in at the store, and she really didn't want to ask her father for any money because he'd already advanced so much to her sisters. Mr. Carpenter assumed that she was asking for somewhere in the ballpark of $300 to $400, which would be a pretty typical amount to buy a sizable inventory of gloves for a store. He told her he didn't have that kind of money himself, but he could find someone who could loan it to her. She told him he had the wrong idea. All she needed was $10. He had $10 in his pocket, so he gave it to her, and she assured him that she would repay it in a few days. Not too long before that, Pearl had asked Attorney Carpenter some questions about a case that he'd handled over in Logansport. It involved a young woman and a man who Wren had gotten arrested as a result of what Wren had done in the case. Pearl expressed deep sympathy for the young woman, and she made the remark that girls cannot be too careful of the company they keep. The paper didn't clarify exactly what had happened between the young woman and man. He could have assaulted her or outraged her, as they called it, or maybe he had simply seduced her.
Back in 1896, Indiana had what was known as seduction laws. If an unmarried man persuaded a woman to have sex by promising to marry her and then abandon her, he could actually face criminal charges. These laws were intended to protect women's reputations because at the time, a pregnancy out of wedlock or even just not being a virgin could destroy a woman's chances at ever being married in the future.
So a man could go to jail for telling a girl he would marry her to make her feel okay with having sex before marriage and then not marrying her. And I think that's great, actually, because lying and coercing and manipulating your way into someone's pants is not okay. I think there should still be consequences for that. That's my opinion. So anyway, Pearl said she needed money to buy some inventory, and really she just wanted $10, which seemed a little bit odd. But it was an easy enough wish to grant, and she got the $10 that she needed. A few days later, on Monday, January 27th, 1896, Pearl told her parents that she was going to take a train over to Indianapolis to visit with her friend Estella Fisher. By this time, she'd had her 23rd birthday, and she'd made this very trip plenty of times before. Her family didn't think anything of it. She said she'd be back the following Saturday, February 1st. Pearl packed 2 suitcases, or valises, as they were called. They were basically overnight bags meant to pack for just a day or two of travel. If you've seen the movie Mary Poppins, imagine the bag that Mary Poppins had that she'd pull all kinds of, things out of. It's like that size, but just not actually magical.
We interrupt this program to bring you breaking news. Newspapers around the world are carrying an unusual story out of England. January 28, 1896 will go down in history as the first time a person was fined for speeding in one of those new horseless carriages. Yes, a gentleman named Walter Arnold is said to have propelled his horseless carriage at the remarkable velocity of 8 miles per hour. Unfortunately for Mr. Arnold, Britain's legal speed limit is just 2 miles per hour. A police officer gave chase for nearly 5 miles on his bicycle before finally catching up with the daring motorist. The court fined Mr. Arnold 1 whole shilling. Well, let this be a lesson to thrill seekers around the globe. Crime does not pay. And now, back to your regularly scheduled programming.
On Tuesday, January 28th, Pearl was escorted to the train station by her 19-year-old cousin, Will Wood. She bought a ticket to Indianapolis and said goodbye to her dear cousin. But all was not as it seemed. Young, respectable Pearl Bryan wasn't known to be a liar, but this time she was lying. When her train arrived in Indianapolis, Pearl went on to buy another ticket. She hopped on a train and took the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton line to her real destination. Pearl Bryan was on her way to Cincinnati.
Thin, get flesh. Weak, get strong. Fat and you and Corpula make a pound of flesh a day. They cure nerve and brain exhaustion. Nothing like Loring's pre-digested, fat-making and life-giving foods was ever known before. Their revivifying power is one of the medical wonders of the age. They rejuvenate prematurely old men and women. Corpula and Fat Tenu together are recognized by the medical profession as a safe and certain cure for nervous prostration. They are perfectly harmless to anyone, in any condition, however delicate. Fat 10U is put up in both tablet and liquid form. Some prefer liquid remedies. Some like the tablets, because they are handy to take while traveling or attending to business. The liquid Fat 10U and the Fat 10U tablets are alike in effectiveness and curative power. Writing from her home in this city, Miss Jenny Wild Warren says,
I took 1 bottle of Fat 10U and 2 bottles of Corpula, and they increased my weight 30 pounds and made me more healthy and vigorous than I had been for years. These foods cured me of sleeplessness and terrible nervous attacks, and gave me fine development where I was too thin and ungraceful.
No treatment better. No treatment cheaper. Corpula, $1 a package. Fat 10U tablets, $1 a package. Liquid Fat 10U, $1 a bottle. Send for How to Get Plump and Rosy. 1 month's treatment, $2 by mail. All leading druggists sell Fat 10U and Corpula. Send mail and express orders to Loring & Co., Department 40.
It was Saturday morning, February 1st, 1896. Just south of Cincinnati, across the Ohio River in Campbell County, Kentucky, a young farmhand named John Hewlin was making his way to work. John worked for a farmer named James Locke, whose property sat just outside of Fort Thomas, the army post. Rather than taking the long way around, John cut across the fields as he had done many times before. Around 8 o'clock that morning, he climbed over a fence and dropped down into an old wagon road that ran through the property. The moment his feet hit the ground, he stopped. Lying at the bottom of a small embankment, just on the other side of the wagon road, was the body of a young woman. She was wearing clothes, but they were in a complete state of disarray. In addition to what she still had on, there were more clothes scattered around her. She had shoes on, there was a lot of blood, but something was missing. Her head. John was horrified. He turned and ran toward the Locke farmhouse, shouting for another farmhand named Mike Noonan. Mike and Mr. Locke's son, William, hurried back to the site with John, and after seeing that John was not imagining things, they immediately notified James Locke. Mr. Locke wasted no time. He rode into Fort Thomas, telegraphed the police in Newport, Kentucky, and notified the military commander. The news spread incredibly quickly. Within a short time, Coroner Tingley, Sheriff Jewel Plummer, former Newport Police Chief Dave Locke, and several other officers had arrived at the scene. Remarkably for the year 1896, no one had disturbed the body. The officers would be able to examine the scene exactly as the killer had left it. The young woman lay on the side of the bank, her feet slightly higher than the rest of her body. Beneath the stump of her neck was a large pool of blood, and blood had splattered onto the leaves and brush nearby. At first glance, investigators believed the murder had taken place exactly where the body was found. The amount of blood certainly seemed to support that conclusion. Her clothing was badly disarranged. The upper part of her dress had been pulled open, but the garments beneath were still fastened, and her skirt had been gathered up around her waist. For a brief time, officers wondered if they were looking at the scene of a sexual assault, but they also recognized that the clothing could simply have been disturbed during a violent struggle. As they searched the surrounding area, they began finding little pieces of the story. One glove lay caught in the brush. A torn piece of her dress hung from a branch a few yards away. Scattered across the ground were several gold-plated hairpins and a handful of black feathers, apparently torn from the hat that she had been wearing. The hat, however, was nowhere to be seen. Then they noticed something else. The muddy ground preserved footprints surprisingly well. Investigators believed that they could actually reconstruct the final moments before the murder. The tracks appeared to show a man and a woman walking side by side along the road. Then, quite suddenly, the woman's footprints changed direction. It looked as though she began running. A newspaper reporter said the officers could see where she had splashed through a patch of mud without trying to avoid it, something they felt she never would have done had she not been desperately trying to escape. The larger footprints looked like they followed her. To the investigators standing there that morning, it looked as though the killer had chased her down. The body itself provided only a few more clues. Aside from the terrible wound at the neck, there were no obvious injuries, except for several deep cuts across the woman's left hand. The coroner believed she had grabbed the blade of the knife itself in one final attempt to save her own life. Her hands and feet were small and delicate. One finger bore the unmistakable callus left behind by years of sewing with a needle. Her fingernails, however, were not especially well kept. She wore one brown kid glove, and the matching glove had been found back in the bushes. By the way, I didn't know until researching this case that a kid glove means it was made from the leather of a baby goat. I thought it was just a term for a certain kind of glove, or small gloves.
Well, it's kind of like lamb chops. They're made from a baby.
Yeah. But yeah, did you know that?
I'm not well versed on leather.
Yeah, I mean, I've
leather
heard the
products.
term kid gloves. Like, I've heard that term so many times, but never.
I never have.
Really? Huh. Yeah, no, I never would have thought that meant it was.
It's just like how I've never heard Episcopal.
Episcopal. Oh my goodness. Okay. So anyway, her clothing puzzled the investigators. Some newspapers would later describe her dress as the sort of inexpensive checkered wrapper that a working class woman might wear around the house beneath a cloak.
Okay, that's kind of rude, but...
Well, it gets ruder. But what's funny is the first time I saw the term wrapper in relation to a dress was actually when we were doing the Edmund Crefeld story. And the women were just wearing their wrappers as they were hiding in the cave.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I thought that it was, Maud's dad just like calling it that. Like it was, you know what I mean? I didn't realize that they actually were called wrappers. Like it was an actual style of dress that they wore under other clothes. So I didn't realize that. But anyway, wrappers were a thing, guys. WRAPPER, not like, rapper. Okay, anyway, they really focused on how cheaply made her clothes were. Other newspapers focused on something entirely different, her shoes. These were not cheaply made. They were black cloth top shoes, size 3.5, and stamped inside was the name of the store that had sold them. It said Lewis and Hayes, Greencastle, Indiana. At the time, no one standing there realized how important those shoes would become. Nearby lay a white corset, almost new, but stained with bloody fingerprints. Typically, the corset is worn under the dress. How did the corset wind up tossed aside while her dress was still on her body? She also wore black wool stockings that had a hole that nobody had attempted to fix. There were black garters with plated buckles, gray Union underwear, and rubber overshoes manufactured by the Lycoming Rubber Company.
If you're like me and you're wondering what gray Union underwear is, do I have the answer for you? Gray Union underwear was more commonly known as a Union suit, not because it had anything to do with the Confederates or Union Army. It was a one-piece suit that combined a long-sleeve shirt and long pants into a single garment, usually fastening with buttons down the front, and yes, featuring the famous button flap in the back, so you could use the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
They were made from wool or heavy cotton. They were designed to keep people warm during cold months and were commonly worn by both men and women. Gray was one of the most common colors because it hid dirt well and was inexpensive to produce. In the winter of 1896, owning a set of gray Union underwear wasn't unusual at all. It was about as ordinary as owning a pair of socks today.
Yep. So she had that on. Everything she was wearing, everything was carefully documented. Every article of clothing, every footprint, every drop of blood. And the officers knew they had very little to work with. I mean, they didn't even have her head. And they couldn't afford to overlook even the smallest detail. The body was then taken to an undertaking establishment in Newport, Kentucky, where Coroner Tingley conducted a more careful examination. His findings answered some questions and raised many more. The young woman appeared to be between 20 and 30 years old, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed approximately 130 pounds. Her fair complexion suggested she was probably blonde. One unusual physical characteristic stood out immediately. The second and third toes on each foot were webbed together. It was the sort of feature that would certainly help someone identify her. The coroner also determined that she had not been sexually assaulted, but he made another discovery that immediately changed the direction of the investigation. The young woman was 5 months pregnant. Now detectives had something to work with. Whoever she was, they believed her pregnancy might be the reason she had been murdered.
Sarsaparilla scents. Any sarsaparilla is sarsaparilla, true. So any tea is tea. So any flower is flower. But grades differ. You want the best. It's so with sarsaparilla. There are grades. If you understood sarsaparilla as well as you do tea and flower, it would be easy to determine. But you don't. How should you? When you are going to buy a commodity whose value you don't know, you pick out an old established house to trade with and trust their experience and reputations. Do so when buying sarsaparilla. Ayer's sarsaparilla has been on the market 50 years. Your grandfather used Ayer's. It is a reputable medicine. There are many sarsaparillas, but only one Ayer's. It cures. Still have doubts? Send for the Cure book. It kills doubts and cures doubters. J.C. Ayer Company, Lowell, Massachusetts.
Whether or not the pregnancy was the reason behind this murder was just a guess, because they really didn't know much. They had no name, no missing person report, and no idea where she had come from. There was no clue at all as to who had brought her to that lonely road outside of Fort Thomas. Witnesses near the military post reported seeing a young couple around 11 o'clock the previous night. The woman was described as small and slender, wearing a black hat and a black fur cape over a lighter-colored dress. The man was tall, strongly built, and wore a dark mustache. A nearby saloon keeper and a soldier named Private Ulrey independently gave essentially the same description of these two people that they saw. According to both men, the couple had walked away from the fort and in the direction of the Locke farm. It was the first real lead in the investigation, and pretty much all the police had, so they pursued it. They certainly had no way of knowing that within just a matter of days, this unidentified, headless woman lying in a Kentucky morgue would become one of the most famous murder victims in American history. With so little to go on, investigators did what investigators always do. They began forming theories. First, they looked at the location. The victim had been left near Fort Thomas, a military post where soldiers from across the country were stationed. Local police knew that prostitutes from Cincinnati frequently crossed the river to visit the area, and before long, they convinced themselves that the unidentified woman was probably one of them. There was truly no real evidence to support that conclusion. In fact, much of it was based on little more than assumption. The clothes were cheaply made, she was pregnant, and she was on this side of the river. That's what pointed them in that direction. The newspapers quickly adopted the same theory. Rather than referring to her simply as an unidentified young woman, many papers described her as a woman of the town, or an inmate of one of Cincinnati's low resorts. Some writers even suggested that her inexpensive clothing proved she belonged to what they called the lower class. But in truth, no one knew who she was. All of the ladies of the town were questioned, and none seemed to know her. There was one that had been missing for a couple weeks, but her description didn't align with this body. She was actually much taller than the unidentified woman. As word of the murder spread, people from all over the region began wondering whether the victim might be someone they knew. This was a time when people could easily disappear. They just had to show up somewhere new, give people a fake name, and none would be the wiser. It was far too easy to get lost, essentially, with friends and family members wondering where you are. Detectives were flooded with suggestions, and I mean flooded. I have a whole list of people that they thought she could be. Families reported missing daughters, employers reported women who hadn't come to work, friends came forward with names of young women who they hadn't heard from in a few months. One by one, those possibilities were investigated, and one by one, they were eliminated. Women arrived at police stations very much alive after reading newspaper articles saying that they had been positively identified as the dead woman. One man went to see the body and he just sobbed because he was certain it was his niece. He identified her by 2 moles on the back of her hand. He was, literally absolutely beside himself. The authorities began to investigate the death, the murder of this man's niece, and naturally they went to the home of her father to ask some questions, and the young lady was there, very much alive. And she did, in fact, have 2 moles on the back of her hand.
I feel bad for her uncle because he really believed she was dead, but also, why didn't he go to the house?
I don't know. I don't know. That is curious. Very curious. But yeah. So, I think there were 2 or 3 people who positively identified the body as their loved one. Like, showed up, looked at it, and said, oh my gosh, yes, this is my sister. Oh no, what happened? All of that. But then they would always find the person to be alive and well. So for a while, it seemed that every missing young woman within 100 miles was being compared to the headless victim in Newport. Whoever this young woman was, no one who truly knew her had come forward. The identification would have to come from an unexpected source. So for 2 whole days, the investigation had basically gone nowhere. Detectives had searched and literally drained huge reservoirs. Bloodhounds had been brought in, they interviewed soldiers, and they chased one false identification after another. But then an observant Newport shoe merchant named L.D. Pook looked at the victim's shoes and noticed something everyone else had overlooked, and nobody else would have understood anyway. The shoes were unusually narrow. Pook turned them over and examined the markings stamped inside, 22 and 11, along with the retailer's name, Lewis and Hayes of Greencastle, Indiana. To most people, those numbers meant absolutely nothing, but to an experienced shoe merchant, they looked familiar. Determined to find out exactly what they meant, Pook traveled to Cincinnati and visited 2 different shoe wholesalers. There, one salesman recognized the markings immediately. The shoes had been manufactured by Drew, Selby & Company of Portsmouth, Ohio, and the numbers weren't random at all. They were part of the French sizing system used by the manufacturer. The victim had worn an unusually small and narrow shoe, making it far less common than an average size. Pook wasn't finished. He traveled on to Portsmouth and he asked to examine the company's sales records. Before long, he found the exact shipment that matched the victim's shoes. Every pair from that production lot had been shipped to a single retailer. They were shipped to Lewis and Hayes in Greencastle, Indiana. Suddenly, the investigation had somewhere to go. Even more remarkably, Pook discovered that this wasn't a style sold all over the country. Every shoe from that particular lot had been sold in Greencastle, Indiana. In fact, it had been a special order manufactured to the shoe store's specifications. These pairs of shoes were 12 of a kind. Yeah, they only made 12. So the shoes on the dead girl were sold in Greencastle. That was 100% established. If detectives could determine who had purchased this specific pair, there was a very good chance that they would finally learn the identity of the murdered woman. There was one more curious detail. Pook noticed that although the shoes were a very rare size and an even rarer make, they didn't actually fit their owner very well. As small as these shoes already were, they were slightly too long for the wearer's foot, and someone had stuffed moss into the toes to make them fit more comfortably. Just an interesting observation.
She has tiny little feet.
I know. I was thinking about that this morning. I wear size 8 shoes. My grandma wears size 5, and I thought she had small feet. But yeah, 3. Size 3.
But not even that. Smaller than that. Probably like a 2.5.
Yeah. Like, so small.
If we're talking foot size, I wear a 9.5.
Ooh.
Because I got wide feet.
But yeah, so I at first was thinking, okay, a size like 3.5, and it said B last also was part of the size, which refers to the size of the mold they used to put the shoe on when they were making it. And so anyway, I Googled it thinking like their sizing must have been different. You know, they must have been different back then because like 3.5 is ridiculous. But no, apparently not. They were just very small feet. So, yeah.
Well, yeah. So Evie, my child, she wears like a 1 or a 2.
Oh, wow. Just imagining because that, you know, the victim was basically slightly like an inch taller than me. And to be held up by those tiny feet just seems weird.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. So Pook, having been, a shoe merchant himself, he had told the police if he were to ever sell a shoe in this size, like it's so rare, he would never forget it. He was like, you can absolutely go to Greencastle. They will remember because this is like a very rare shoe size. So I wonder if she had gone there and said, hey, I want shoes like this, and they ordered them in that size.
It seems like it, since they were special order.
Yeah, and they got just 12 pairs, and yeah, that'd be interesting to find out.
Just kept them there when she needed new ones.
Yeah, maybe she always went there. They always had some in her size. I don't know. Anyway, so it was now Monday, February 3rd, just 2 days after the body had been found. Pook gave the information to Sheriff Jewel Plummer and Detectives Cal Krim and Jack McDermott. That night, they boarded a train for Greencastle, Indiana, and they took the victim's clothing with them. They hoped that the shoes would finally put a name to the young woman whose murder had already captivated the nation. While detectives were boarding a train for Greencastle, events there had already begun moving in basically the same direction. Back at the Bryan home, Pearl's family had spent the last several days growing increasingly uneasy. When Pearl left Greencastle on Tuesday, January 28th, she told her parents she was traveling to Indianapolis to visit her friend Estella Fisher. Nothing about the trip seemed unusual. She was cheerful when she left, carrying 2 small valises, and her brother Fred even slipped her $5 for the journey. She insisted she didn't really need the money, and she promised to pay him back when she returned. She told everyone that she would be home within a few days. Then something strange happened. 2 days later, on Thursday, January 30th, while she was still gone, a package arrived from Cincinnati. Inside was one of Pearl's hair switches that she had left to be repaired. The family was puzzled. If Pearl was in Indianapolis, why had the hairpiece been mailed from Cincinnati? This didn't make a whole lot of sense. Still, they didn't worry. Perhaps she had simply made a short trip over there with Estella. Pearl would certainly be able to explain it once she got back. She wasn't expected for 2 more days. Saturday came. It was February 1st, and news broke of a headless body found in Kentucky. Gosh, what a story. Pearl would most likely be eager to talk about it with them once she got home. Everyone was talking about it. But Saturday came to a close, and Pearl hadn't arrived. Perhaps she simply decided to stay in Indianapolis a bit longer. Or maybe she'd missed the train? Someone in the family said that they thought she had said she'd be home Monday. So maybe they just had the date wrong. Nothing to worry about. But Monday came, and Monday went, and Pearl never came home. As newspaper coverage of the headless body intensified, the Bryans followed the reports with the same morbid curiosity as everyone else. At first, it never occurred to them that the victim could be Pearl. The newspapers described the young woman as someone from Cincinnati's underworld, a prostitute who frequented the military post at Fort Thomas. That was certainly not Pearl, not by a long shot. Then came the story about the shoes. Newspapers reported that the victim had been wearing shoes sold by Lewis and Hayes of Greencastle, and for the first time, the Bryan family felt a bit of a chill. Could it possibly be Pearl? Her younger brother, Frank, hurried to Greencastle's city marshal, Thomas Starr, hoping someone in the marshal's circle might already know whether the mystery had been solved. Marshal Starr tried to reassure him. He said he really didn't think he had anything to worry about. Surely there was a simple explanation. Pearl had gone to Indianapolis, after all. She was nowhere near Kentucky. Marshal Starr finally told him that the easiest way to alleviate his fears would be to send a telegram to Estella Fisher and simply ask whether or not Pearl was still there. And it sounded perfectly reasonable. So Frank hurried over to the Western Union and sent the telegram. When the reply came back, his heart dropped. His whole world changed. Pearl Bryan wasn't there. She had never been there. Pearl Bryan had not gone to Indianapolis at all. Suddenly, the impossible became frighteningly possible. Word spread through Greencastle almost immediately. Most people refused to believe it. Pearl Bryan was one of the best-known young women in town. She had graduated from the local high school with honors, attended church socials and parties, and came from one of the community's most respected families. Surely this couldn't be Pearl Bryan. Marshal Starr still thought it was a long shot. He decided to look into everything to prove that this could not be Pearl Bryan. But the deeper he dug, the more every clue pointed in the same direction. Meanwhile, Sheriff Jewel Plummer and Detectives Cal Krim and Jack McDermott were in Greencastle visiting the Lewis and Hayes shoe store. This store kept a very detailed ledger. They wrote down the information for every shoe they sold, as well as the name of the customer. They flipped back through time, page by page, until they got to November 18th, 1895. Just a couple months earlier, that very pair of shoes was sold, size 3.5 with B as the width. The serial numbers matched perfectly. The size matched perfectly. Then the clerk looked at the name written beside the purchase. Pearl Bryan. Now both the Kentucky detectives and the Bryan family are converging on the same awful conclusion. It was around midnight when the detectives tracked down Pearl's sisters from the millinery shop. They introduced themselves and they showed them the clothing that the headless victim had been wearing when she was found. The sisters both positively identified the clothing as Pearl's. In fact, the dress covered in blood had previously belonged to another sister, Jenny. 25-year-old Jenny had died the previous July. Just 6 months earlier, the family had buried Jenny, and now they're looking at Jenny's dress. But this time, it was soaked with Pearl's blood. It was 1:00 a.m. on Wednesday, February 5th, when the sheriff and the detectives from Kentucky went to the home of Alexander and Susan Bryan. They needed the parents to identify the clothes as well. It was almost more than Susan Bryan could bear. She immediately recognized Jenny's dress. 6 months earlier, it belonged to one daughter, and now it was stained with the blood of another. The mystery woman finally had a name. She was Pearl Bryan. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Who had murdered her, and where was her head?
Eli's Cream Balm. Eli's Cream Balm opens and cleanses the nasal passages, allays pain and inflammation, heals the sores, protects the membrane from colds, restores the senses of taste and smell. The balm is quickly absorbed and gives relief at once. For your protection, we positively state that this remedy does not contain mercury or any other injurious drug. Price 50 cents at druggists or by mail. Eli Brothers, 56 Warren Street, New York.
Now that investigators finally knew the identity of the victim, the investigation changed almost overnight. They no longer needed to ask, who was this young woman? Now they needed to answer a far more urgent question. Who had lured Pearl Bryan to that isolated road in northern Kentucky? As it turned out, detectives in Greencastle already had a head start. One of the first people they interviewed was W.A. Early, the manager of the Western Union Telegraph Office. Early happened to be a friend of William Farrow Wood, one of Greencastle's best-known young men. He was the son of the Reverend. Well, over the previous several months, Wood had occasionally shown him letters he had received from his friend Scott Jackson, who had previously lived in Greencastle but was now attending dental college in Cincinnati. At the time, the letters hadn't seemed particularly important, but when rumors began swirling that Pearl Bryan had never gone to Indianapolis and never came home, Mr. Early looked at them very differently. He got in touch with Greencastle detectives on February 4th, the same day the Kentucky detectives were at the Lewis and Hayes shoe store in Greencastle. Mr. Early went to share what he knew. According to Mr. Early, the letters from Scott Jackson repeatedly urged Will Wood to carry out a plan that the two young men had discussed. The language was vague, but there were enough unusual expressions and oddly worded hints to convince investigators that Scott Jackson might somehow be connected to Pearl's disappearance. For detectives, it was the first real lead pointing to an actual suspect. By the morning of February 5th, the investigation had changed completely. Instead of searching for an unknown killer of an unknown woman, police now had 3 names at the center of the mystery: Pearl Bryan, Scott Jackson, and William Farrow Wood. Around noon on Wednesday, February 5th, telegraph operators in Greencastle began tapping out urgent messages across the Midwest. One wire went to Cincinnati.
Attention. Chief Philip Deach. Arrest and charge with murder of Pearl Bryan. One Scott Jackson, student at Dental College. About 24 years old, 5 feet 7 or 8 inches high, weighs about 135 pounds. Blonde, nearly sandy mustache. Light complexion. May have beard of 6 months' growth. Effeminate in appearance. Positive identification of clothing by family. Also arrest, if in Cincinnati, William Wood, friend of Jackson. Charge as accomplice. About 20 years, 5 feet 11 inches. Light blonde hair, smooth face, rather slender. Weighs 165 pounds. We go from here to South Bend, after Wood, as he left here for that place. Crim, McDermott, and Plummer.
Another telegram sped to South Bend, Indiana, instructing them to arrest William Wood if he was there. The race was on. Scott Jackson had absolutely no idea that the body found in Kentucky had been identified as Pearl Bryan. And even more importantly, he had no way of knowing that detectives in Greencastle and Kentucky had already connected his name to hers. As soon as Chief Deach received the urgent telegram, he detailed Detectives Witt, Jackson, and Bulmer to find and arrest Scott Jackson. The Cincinnati officers made their way to the Ohio College of Dental Surgery, and they found that he wasn't there. They got his address, however, and they had the boarding house under surveillance through that afternoon and evening. At around 7 o'clock p.m., Scott happened to run into his roommate, Alonzo Walling. They were at the corner of 6th and Race Streets. They spoke just briefly, and then they parted ways again, having no idea that their boarding house at 222 West 9th Street was under surveillance, and that the police were looking for Scott. Detective Bulmer had been standing on the north side of 9th Street near Elm at 9:45 p.m. This is when he saw Scott Jackson going hurriedly west on the south side of the street. According to Bulmer, when Scott looked across the street and saw the detective, he almost started running. Bulmer was able to overtake him and arrest him. They had found 26-year-old Scott Jackson. By 10:45 that night, Scott Jackson was in the mayor's office undergoing an interrogation by both the mayor and the chief of police. He remained calm throughout, though his face visibly flushed, and he had a hard time looking them square in the face. At one point during the questioning, he blurted out,
"Why don't you arrest Walling?"
Alonzo Walling was then hunted down and taken into custody by Cincinnati detectives as well. Scott Jackson readily admitted that he knew Pearl Bryan. He admitted they had spent time together in Greencastle. He insisted that he had never been intimate with her in any way, and he said that he absolutely had not murdered her. Alonzo Walling also admitted to knowing who she was and knowing that she was dead, but he said that he had absolutely not murdered her either. It was clear that neither of them were going to talk, so they let the prisoners sleep and they picked it back up in the morning. While this had all been going on, detectives had searched through their rooms at the boarding house. Right there in Jackson's room were letters from William Wood. They were very incriminating, very filthy, and too brutal for publication. One letter dated February 1st, written while Will was in South Bend, was asking Jackson for the latest news. And in it, he said,
"If you've grown chicken-hearted, you ought to be shot."
On the morning of Thursday, February 6th, 1896, things really got underway for the investigation, and interestingly enough, both Scott and Alonzo were willing to talk. The police felt like they were about to get this case solved. Scott Jackson admitted that Pearl was murdered, but he denied having done it. He said that William Wood, Pearl's cousin, had contacted him and told him that he, William Wood, had gotten Pearl pregnant. He said that Will asked him if he could perform an abortion on Pearl. He said that he couldn't personally do it, but he knew that his roommate, Alonzo Walling, had performed one in the past, so he would check to see if Alonzo was willing to do it. Jackson said that he wasn't there during the procedure, he doesn't know what happened, but he does admit that she was killed during an attempt to perform the abortion. Scott Jackson also admits that Pearl arrived Tuesday the 28th. He saw her on Wednesday the 29th, which was the last time he saw her, and that after she was dead, he took her clothing out of her valises and slowly threw her belongings into the Ohio River over the next few days. He admitted this was to cover up what Walling had done. Well, the previous Monday night, February 3rd, which was 2 days after the body was found, Scott Jackson had walked into a barber shop with a valise. He set it down and told the barber not to let anyone have it other than himself. This had been turned over to the police, and the police brought it into the interrogation room to show him. Chief Deach handed it to Jackson and said,
"Open that valise. What do you see in there?" "Stains?"
was his nervous reply.
"What sort of stains?" "Must be blood stains." "Was it the head that made those stains?" "Well, I should think it was." "Was it there that you carried the head?" "I tell you, I didn't carry the head."
The valise was stained with blood all over the inside, on the bottom and the sides.
"I never carried it with anything in it. Walling wanted me to carry it, but I would not do it."
Scott Jackson had admitted that Pearl Bryan was dead. He admitted that an abortion had been attempted. He admitted that he had thrown Pearl's belongings into the Ohio River. He admitted that the blood-stained valise had once held her severed head, but he insisted he had nothing to do with her murder because, according to Scott Jackson, Alonzo Walling had done it. And that's where we'll end the story for now. You may think they've just solved this case, but this was only the beginning.
In old Kentucky State was late in January. This awful deed was done by Wallen and by Jackson. How cold her blood did run.
Okay, the cousin maybe getting her pregnant. Thrown for a loop. I was not expecting that.
It just gets crazier and crazier, my friend.
Okay, well, shout out Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, FamilySearch.com, Pixabay.com, Findagrave.com, My Brother Christian. Follow our social medias, mostly just Facebook, at Forgotten Felonies. We chat on there.
A special thank you to Seth Elkins and William Griffin at Smithsonian Folkways for approving my request to use the Pearl Bryan folk song so quickly. We got fast-tracked, and I appreciate that so much. And a shout out to the Phipps Family Band, who in 1965 recorded the specific version of the song that we used. And the song is simply entitled Pearl Bryan.
So why did you have to get permission?
Because it's copyrighted.
The Smithsonian owns the copyright?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, yeah, the song itself, the, lyrics and sheet music or whatever is in the public domain, but there's no recording of the song that is not copyrighted. So I just looked up who owns the copyright, and there was a list of 3 different recordings and 3 different places that own it, and I just reached out to these guys and they said yes.
The Smithsonian
Folkways is part of the Smithsonian Institution.
Nice.
That's it. Yep. Pretty cool.
Well, until part 2.
Oh, yeah, and it gets crazy. We'll hear exactly what happened after she got off the train, really. So,
oh, because I don't know that yet.
I take us back again to January 28th. So, I didn't realize that. But anyway, rappers were a thing, guys. WRAPPER, not rapper.
Exactly. Her name is Pearl. She had a head, and now it's gone because she is dead.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Stick to karaoke. Okay, so.
I don't know. I thought that was pretty good.
It was pretty good, on the fly. Good for you. Okay, but anyway.
If we get canceled for this, I'm so sorry.
Is it too soon to to make a joke like that. I don't know, like 130 years. So.
Hey, because she died in 96, and that was 100 years before I was born.
Yeah. No. Yeah. No.
Mhm.
Yeah. I'm like, hang on a second. I wasn't there, was I? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, anyway, so they really focused on how cheaply made her clothes were.